We have all been in really scary situations in our life, but as a Christian, why am I still afraid? Why do I lay awake at night wondering, what's going to happen? Today, we're going to see that even King David had his moments. But as he grew closer and closer to God, he trusted God more and feared less. Join us today as we work through Psalm 27. All right, good morning. Welcome to our Psalm series. Glad you are joining us. Last week we started working through Psalm 27, and we made it through exactly one verse, okay? Because this particular psalm is a lot like Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, that psalm. Because there's so much meaning to this psalm and so much deep application that I wanted to just take it a few verses at a time. Last week we made it through one verse, okay? So we'll make it a couple extra verses today. Now, last week we started with David, King David. Something's going on in his life, or he knows something's coming. I guess we could probably look at it like that. And what is coming into his life is something that would bring you and I fear. Like, I don't know, someone just broke in my house and tried to kill us, okay? That kind of fear. Maybe our child is out to destroy us. Just little things like that. That was David's life, okay? Because when we read the Bible, we see that so much of his life was filled with dangerous situations, bad guys chasing him, people trying to hurt him, all of these things. And yet we saw last week in verse 1 that David began with this. Psalm 27:1, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" And we actually talked about last week that who should he be afraid of? Nobody and nothing. And that's the same with us. The more we grow up in our faith, we get to that point where it's like, I don't know, God's got this. We talked about that last week. But David starts in this psalm knowing in advance that there's no reason to be fearful of anything that might be coming down the pike, because David learned his trust was in God. Now, as I read this, it reminded me that David knew this because he had been in scary situations. That's just David's life. He was in so many different scary situations, but he saw how God came through for him every time. Think about the story of David and Goliath. Goliath should have killed David in like 3 seconds, okay? But God made sure that David, a little teenage boy, took down the giant with a slingshot and a rock. David didn't take credit for that. David knew that God did that for him. David knew that when Saul's men were surrounding the cave he was in, and they were just getting ready to come in and kill him. But God arranged for the Philistines to be attacking Israel in another place, and just then a messenger came up and was like, "Saul, we need to leave." And before they could kill David, Saul left with his army without harming David. David knew that God did that. David knew when Saul's men were trying to kill him in his sleep, and his wife helped him get away. David knew that God did that. Because this was the theme of David's life. God was his shield, his protector, his light, his salvation. So when David starts out this psalm, it's as if he's planning on something bad that's going to come into his life. But he wasn't fearful of what was coming, because he had seen God come through time and time again, and he knew that God would take care of him. Hence, why he keeps saying, no fear. Look at verse 2. This is the NIV translation. "When evil men advance against me to devour my flesh," he's saying, when this is going to happen, when they come against me, when my enemies and my foes attack me, they will stumble and fall. He's like, I know this. Bad guys are going to come towards me, but you know what? I trust God that they're going to stumble and fall. I love how the Message puts this. It says this in verse 2. When vandal hordes ride down ready to eat me alive, those bullies and toughs fall flat on their faces. That's what David's used to, okay? Look at verse 3, NIV. Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then will I be confident. Look at what the Message says. The Message version says this. When besieged, I'm as calm as a baby. When all hell breaks loose, I'm collected and cool. And that's the place where I want to get in my life, and I want you to get to in your life. But here's the problem. We go, why don't I feel that way? Why am I still afraid? Why do I still lay awake at night worrying? And I think we need to remember that a lot of this has to do with growing up in our faith. It's like, as we have seen through the life of David, that David wasn't always calm, cool, and collected. David wasn't always like, oh, I just trust God, I'm fine. David grew into that, just like you and I need to grow into that too. There were many times he was terrified, and one of those is quite shocking. We'll talk about this, because I want you to see that even great men of God have days of fear, but then as they grow up in their faith and know that God can be trusted, that fear really does subside. But this was one of these times in his life when he was a disaster. At this particular point, David's running from the king, of course, King Saul. And King Saul happened to be his father-in-law, who was crazy jealous of David. And so he's going after David because he assumes David wants to take his throne. And David's tired. And David's tired of running. And he's tired of being fearful. And he's just tired of it all. So we see David do something that's really crazy, okay? Remember Goliath, when we talked about he killed Goliath? Goliath was a Philistine. But Goliath was from his hometown called Gath in Philistine country. So here's a map right here. We'll put this up. You can see that gray area over there is the Philistine. It's where the Philistines live. And you can see Gath on there. It's kind of right smack in sort of the middle there. You've got Israel on one side, the Philistine territory on the other. Now, King Saul has been chasing David around the Israel side. And David's had enough. And he's like, I'm going to go to the Philistine side. They're the arch enemies of Israel. Oh, why would he do that? He runs to Gath, like the place where Goliath is from. Doesn't seem like a smart move at all. And this scene that we see doesn't even look like that David is trusting God very much at all. Look at this, 1 Samuel 21, verse 10. That day, David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath, okay, Philistine country. But the servants of Achish said to him, isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one they sing about, their dances? Like, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. They're like, isn't this David? That guy who killed Goliath and is so popular that everyone sings songs about him. And David hears that and becomes terrified. He's all by himself up against the Philistine, people. Verse 12 says this, David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. So look what he does. This is the future king of Israel, the man that everyone in Israel loves, the man after God's own heart. Look what he does in verse 13. So he pretended to be insane. You're like, what? He pretended to be insane. And in their presence, while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, okay? Making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. You're like, this is David? This is King David, the one who just wrote in Psalm 27 that the Lord is my light and my salvation, my stronghold. Whom shall fear? This is what I'm saying. It takes time to grow to a Psalms 27 place. I don't think at this scene David was like that. Verse 14 says this, Achish said to his servants, look at the man, he's insane. Why bring him to me? And I go, yep, that's our, the Lord is my light and my salvation guy. He's acting like a crazy man. He's scratching a door. He's got saliva running down his beard. That's fear. That is being very afraid. But here's the good news. God used that difficult situation to grow David's faith. To show David that God would take care of him, even in Philistine territory. God needed to get David to a place where David could look back and say, I would never act like that today. I mean, I look back when I was younger and I think, wow, I was so fearful for that. I don't know that I would respond that way now. Because I think that's what happens when people grow up in their faith. They learn to trust God so that their fear is less and less. Because for David, this situation taught him how to trust God. Because that's what trials do for us. And God does that with you and with me. We grow in our faith most in the difficult days. It's the days we get fired from our job. It's the day we can't suddenly pay our bill. We're like, I got this bill in and I don't even know, I have no money to pay it. God grows our faith when our kids hate us or when our neighbors snub us, when our sickness gets worse, when our marriage seems hopeless, when our child goes to prison, when we lose a loved one. It's in those days, the days of struggle. Those are the days that teach us who God is and how much he can be trusted. It's like the struggles of an emperor moth. The cocoon of an emperor moth is like a bottle. Okay, so think of a bottle and then it goes up and has a little neck on it. But to develop into a perfect insect, a perfect moth, it must force its way up through that bottle, the bottleneck of the cocoon. And there's this struggle, this intense struggle for this moth to get through that little teeny tiny hole. Entomologists explain that it's the pressure to which the moth is subjected to nature's way of forcing a life-giving substance into his wings. So it's like without doing that and forcing itself, that's what gives the moth the growth of the wings and the wings to be able to go out and fly. But it's amazing that moths can only fly because of the struggle it has to go through. That's how he can fly. And I think that's a lesson for us. That it takes struggles in our life to grow in our faith with our relationship with Christ. One day, someone was watching this little moth struggle in the cocoon. And he thought, I'm just gonna, that just looks like that poor little moth is just so sad. That's hard work. I'm gonna help him along. And so this person took a little pair of scissors and snipped the restraining threads to make the moth be able to come out, without having to struggle. For a brief time before its death, the only thing that moth could do was crawl. He could never fly. He could never fly through up into the sky with these beautiful wings. Why? Because he didn't suffer. He couldn't get to that point because he wasn't strong enough. Here's what you and I need to know, and we learned this from David. Sorrow, suffering, trials, and tribulations are wisely designed to grow us into Christ-likeness. They just really are. The refining and developing processes are oftentimes slow. We get that. But through God's grace, we can emerge triumphant if we hang in there. David knew this because with each trial, when his life was in turmoil, that is when he grew the closest to God. Those are the times when things seem to be falling apart that God has a chance to get our attention and show up. Okay? Those are the times that reminds us that God really is in control of everything, that he really does have a plan. And with each scary circumstance that comes into our life, David saw, just like we can see, David saw that his faith was strengthened through the difficult days, which is why he can write Psalm 27. Whatever was about to happen to David, before it even happened, David could say this in verse 2, when evil men advance against me to devour my flesh, when my enemies and my foes attack me, they will stumble and fall. Though an army besiege me, my heart will what? Will not fear. Though war breaks out against me, even then will I be confident. David had seen God come through time and time again, and because of that, as David grew older, his trust grew greater in God. Not thinking this, because this is our problem. We just assume that trusting God means that God's going to give us everything we want, do what we want. We pray, God says yes. But if you look at the life of David, that's not true. David had a lot of things going on in his life. But what David learned was that he could put God into any situation. And when he did, his fear would lessen. Because when you get this high view of God, that God is in control, that he's given us a number of days on this earth, we know the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. When you know that and you're settled with that, we don't have to be afraid of anything. Oh, that guy's going to come in and kill me. Oh, well, I guess then my days are numbered. They're up. I'm going home to heaven. Oh, well, that person's going to hurt me. Maybe I'll end up in the hospital. I don't know. Maybe someone needs to hear about Jesus in the hospital. Like, we just think differently about life. But like I said, David knew it didn't always mean things were going to go great for him. Like, trusting God doesn't mean we're just going to have health and wealth and happiness and everything's going to go good and we're going to have the white picket fence. It doesn't mean that. If you study the life of David, which we kind of have been doing in this Psalm series, his life was kind of a disaster. His home was a disaster. His baby dies. He prayed and prayed that God would save his baby. Nope. His son died after trying to take David's throne away from him. His other son died because he raped his half-sister. Like, oh, for the love, okay? The town where David, lived in the Philistine territory was burned to the ground and his wife was kidnapped. We could go on and on about this, but David learned to trust God, whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, knowing that God was intimately involved in every situation. Not that it was going to get better, but that whatever it was going to grow his faith stronger. It's like Jesus. Think about when Jesus faced this, torturous death on a cross. I bet he was afraid. I think that's a first normal response. Like, I don't know, we get that when the phone rings in the middle of the night or the police show up at your door. God gave us this emotion called fear, but we're not supposed to stay there. We see Jesus, Mark 14:34, in the Garden of Gethsemane. He says, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. He's like, stay here with me. I think he was overwhelmed with sorrow, and I bet fear to some extent. This was going to be a horrific thing he was facing. And he even prays in verse 36 for God to can we do something different? Look at this in verse 36. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. See, he's like, this plan seemed good when we were in heaven talking about it, but now that I'm here and we're going through it, it doesn't sound like I really want to do this. Can we go to plan B? But unfortunately, there was no plan B. And Jesus made this statement. It reminds us that that's how we should look at life. Like, you know what? Here's the deal. God, I know you can make this better for me. God, I know you can do anything. Let's not do this, God. But then in the end, Jesus said, but not my will, but your will. He learned to trust God, that God had a will and a plan for his life in the midst of sorrow, in the midst of pain, in the midst of all the bad stuff. Because this is what David knew. He knew God could see the big picture. The death of Jesus on a cross was painful and horrible for Jesus and for everyone watching it. But there was a big monster plan in place. And the same goes through with your life and whatever it is you're going through. God has a plan and a purpose for what is happening in your life. And we need to do what Jesus did, which was surrender his will to his Father. And I will tell you this, when you get to this point, your life will change. When we can say this, God, I don't really like the news I just got from the doctor. God, I don't like that my marriage is so bad. God, I don't like it that my child is so uncontrollable. God, I don't like it, and you can fill in your own blank. But God, here's the deal. I trust you. I may fear for the moment, but I have surrendered my life to you, and I want your will over mine because something is going on that I don't see. So I'm not going to be afraid, and I'm not going to fear. I'm going to trust. Because see, when we grow up in our faith like that, the more you read your Bible, the more you get to know God, the more you learn he can be trusted. And that's when we can get to the point of saying this in Psalm 27. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Whom shall I be afraid? When evil men advance against me to devour my flesh, when my enemies and my foes attack me, they will stumble and fall. Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then I will be confident. That is a man who has learned to trust God through trials, knowing no matter whatever came in his life, God was in it and knew what he's doing. And when you can get to that point, and when I can get to that point, it will change our life completely. Hope that helps today. Have a really good day.